Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. As most of you know, today is the day that we start for the next 3 weeks, I think it is, the presentations from our summer interns who have been working hard all summer and hopefully having a good time and enjoying themselves. And so we usually we have the faculty who's the mentor introduce, so I will turn over the microphone to Karen. I just want to warn people, and I guess I have to apologize for whoever the third speaker is today. Someone scheduled a meeting that I unfortunately could not change, so I need to leave about 12:25. So I may miss the end of the last talk, and it's not out of lack of interest or anything. It's just that unfortunately someone schedules a meeting. But we actually have 90 minutes. So take your time and ask questions, and we'll look forward to hearing what's happened. So I will turn it over to Karen.
Hi, thank you. This has been a great opportunity for us to work together on a couple of efforts. So some of you may know that Dr. Nelson and I have developed a tool to help patients understand whether they're at average risk or above average risk for breast cancer. And it's also a decision aid. So some of you may have seen some of the presentations or seen us at Research Week. But we had the opportunity this summer to have the tool translated into Spanish, and Ayo's going to be speaking about that today. And then Gokul is going to tell us about his early work in trying to integrate our tool, which currently resides outside of Epic, to talk to Epic. So you're going to hear about that early effort as well. So I will now turn it over. I believe Ayo is first.
All right, so really quickly before Ayo goes, I'd like to just give a brief overview or sort of introduction. So thank you all for being here today and allowing us to present in front of you. I mean, it's been a wonderful summer, and you know the work has been great, and really we've learned a lot, truly. So thank you. And you know, over the past 10 or so weeks, myself and Ayo have been working on different sort of projects, but related to the same memo screen project Dr. Eden and Dr. Nelson have worked on. And so, you know, in the following presentation, we hope to describe what we've done, maybe share some reflections, some insight, and things like that. So, Ayo, I think hand it off to you.
The work we've done for the past few weeks. So a brief introduction to MammoScreen. MammoScreen was a tool, an app developed by Dr. Eden and Dr. Nelson to help women over the age of, or 40 or older, with decision regarding a breast cancer screening. For women between the age of 40 and 50, whether they should get screening done or not. And for women older than 50, how often they should get breast cancer screening. This is what the web page looks like. As you can see, it's simple but very helpful, as I'll show you. So, what is MammoScreen? MammoScreen is composed of two different parts. One, which is the risk assessment. The risk assessment consists of asking the person about their personal history, their family's history, BRCA 1 and 2, which Gokul will later kind of talk about, and just in general, how at risk they are for developing breast cancer. And this is then used for the second portion, which is the decision aid, and that uses the risk, how at risk they are, their preferences on how they feel about screening, and what they're most scared of. And this is to help facilitate a conversation between a physician and the patient about breast cancer. And this is what the title page, the cover page for MammoScreen looks like. So what was my job in all this? My job, I was searching for the right word, and while translating does encompass some portions of what I was doing. A word that I found that really encompassed what I did this summer was metaphrasing. So here I have the definitions for metaphrase. The first definition that I found was to translate, especially literally. And so that's very important. You have to know how to translate something. However, more so to what I was doing and what really was important in this project that I did was to manipulate the text so as to get the point across. And that was something that was surprisingly difficult. And so I'd like you all to take 10 seconds or so and just look at this image and think about the different objects that you may see or what you see in this image. And so some of you might have seen a fairy, some of you might have seen a hummingbird, some of you might have seen a mustache, a butterfly, 2 lions. There are a variety of ways this can be interpreted. And this is the problem that I ran into. Dr. Eden, when she began working with Mammal Screen, as she developed the app, she had to design graphics or images to convey the message. And this was one of the images that she talked about 2 weeks ago that was misinterpreted. At first, they had 1 person instead of 2, and that person had on the left side a slowly growing cancer tumor, and on the right side, one that grew quickly. And there was a person that interpreted that as, well, on the left side, on the right side, it'll grow slowly, and on the left side, it'll grow quickly. And so they had to make sure and use 2 different people and show that it could be on either side, and that really the point that they were trying to get at was that there were 2 different things. You couldn't really tell just by the place there that was on the body whether it grew slowly or not. And so here's a sample problem of really how that related to my work of translating the text. So this is one of the portions that a patient first encounters, portions of text that the patient first encounters when they take the Mammal Screen decision aid. And so it says a breast cancer screening decision aid for women 40 and older. It's just a description for what Mammal Screen is. When this was automatically translated, the translation that came up was una decisión de detección de cáncer. Well, I mean, I could read it, but I don't know how many of you understand Spanish. And so as I was looking at this is not the right translation. And so I went ahead and translated it. And this translation is a lot longer. And why is that? Well, that's because the literal translation, each word does have a literal translation. However, when you use the word, for example, decision aid, there's no actual word in Spanish to describe that. And so you have to describe the overall use of it and how a person would use it rather than just using the literal word translations. And so what the first automatic translation actually means is help to take a decision about breast cancer screening in women 40 years or older. And that's, I mean, it's help, but like it's not, doesn't really describe what it is. It's kind of gets the meaning across, but it loses some context, and depending on who you are, it can be ambiguous. And that's what I was aiming to do as I was translating, get rid of the ambiguity. And so here's the process. I worked a lot with the Content Manager, which is a repository that has all the content that is shown in the app. Here is the English version, and here's the Spanish version that I translated. One of the hardest parts with working with this was definitely having code within the actual text. And so I had to make sure that, for example, bolded words had the right emphasis in Spanish than in English. And so, like, especially for images. And that was something that I struggled with. That and working with Excel, because Excel isn't particularly too friendly with writing out stuff. So, and well, it would be great if I was done there, but no. After going through the first draft you have to go back and double check yourself. And for example, one of the things that I found was something as simple as the button to turn it into Spanish was misspelled. And so I had to go back and make note of that so that that could be a change that our programmer could take care. And so this is just like the first couple of examples of stuff that I had to go back and review. And we're done, right? Well, no. So in addition to that, I then had to go and find people that spoke Spanish. So in Spanish, there are lots of dialects. There's those that are from Spain and they speak their own dialect. There are those even from within different regions of Mexico that speak different dialects. Central Americans speak different, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, not Brazilians. Brazilians speak something else. But Argentinians, etc. They all have their own dialects, their own versions of Spanish, and they don't all understand the exact same phrase. And so I went ahead and tried to find as wide of a scope as I could out in the community. And thankfully, Dr. Eden already had some sort of interview guidelines that she used with the Spanish version to make sure like the images were conveying the right message. And so I'm translating those and using them as a kind of structure for the interviews that I held with the new people or the new interviewees. Really helped me make it more efficient. So thankfully, I think I'm done. Wait, did I forget the screenshot of the finish? Oh no, it's there. All right. Okay, so this is what it ended up. This was the final product. Much like the original version in English, my aim was really to keep the format, to keep the original intent, but just translate it in Spanish and make sure that the message that was originally in English was also conveyed in the Spanish version. So now, now that I've talked about the work that we've done for the past 10 weeks, let's reflect a little bit on the work that I've done. So at first, I thought this was going to be very straightforward. However, I encountered some problems. So the first of those problems was getting a clear message, making sure that the person was getting the message across, or not that the person was getting the message across, that the writing that was translating, the translations were getting the point across, and that was very hard. Well, not very hard, but it was definitely took a lot more effort than I originally anticipated. And the second, I guess, the second thing that made it hard for me to really do it as fast as I could have, or I wanted to, was having a programmer that was not part of the OHSU, because I couldn't really upload the new content as I was editing it, and so I had to wait for them to update the website. And so sometimes people would point out the same mistakes, and keeping track of which mistakes were already noticed and which ones weren't was a little hard. And so what did I learn? Well, I learned that you always have to click save when you're working with Microsoft Office. I learned it the hard way. I learned that you always have to double check your work. I had to do lots of that. And then, most importantly, I learned that the Department of Medical Informatics and Clinical Epidemiology is more than just working with data, and it really does help connect people with people. So I'll hand it off to Gokul, who will proceed to explain how he worked with code. That's about all I know.
All right. Well, thank you, Ayo. I'm sure your work is going to help MemoScreen impact so many more people than it would have previously. So seriously, thank you for your work. And, well, I did the data integration part of this presentation. And what I worked on over the summer in large part was how do I get data from one place and put it into another? And in this case, it would be MemoScreen. And, you know, in approaching this sort of problem, the question that I asked myself going in was, all right, well, how do I access the appropriate patient information that I need from an EHR? And how do I then put that into MemoScreen? And so this was the sort of question that that guided my project throughout the summer. And so in order to answer this question, there are certain processes that I had to take and certain paths that I had to go through to get to where I finished and to create something meaningful. And so as an overview, what I did could be classified under 3 basic categories. So first, I had to gain an understanding of an EHR and EHR systems and see how I could use that to then code and do something meaningful. And after that, I had to learn how to use Fire and Fire tools, things like Smart on Fire, to actually interact with an EHR in a way that I needed it to. And lastly, after doing those 2 things, I needed to use Smart on Fire to actually pull the patient data that I wanted and put it into a program. Now, things like EHR and Smart on Fire might be some terms that are foreign to some of my fellow interns here. So I'm going to clarify those, don't worry. And so just bear with me here. And so first, what is an EHR? Well, it's literally just, if you took all those papers that physicians would write stuff down in and you put it online, I mean, that's exactly what an EHR is. It's just a place where all of this patient data is stored and centralized. And so this is what an EHR is. And for my project, this was exactly where I needed to gather data from. I mean, this was this gold mine, if you will, of patient data that I could use to put in a memo screen. But as much as it is a gold mine, different EHR platforms work different from one another. So how something is stored in Epic, for example, OHSU's EHR, might be different from how something is stored on a Cerner EHR. And different EHRs have different criteria for all sorts of different things. So, I mean, this is a difficulty that many people were thinking about, and that's where actually my next slide comes into play, is something called Fire. And so in order to combat the variability between EHRs, a standard was developed, fast healthcare interoperability resources, whereby you can pull, or at least in theory, you can pull information from different EHRs easily because they're all stored in a similar way in Fire resource types. And so basically, how it works is there's a Fire resource which has a standard set of behaviors, and you can use that to then do things, right? And if it was as straightforward as it sounded, well, I wouldn't need like the rest of my presentation, honestly. But again, I mean, so then we could talk about, well, despite the fact that Fire claims to standardize things, really, it doesn't do that. I'll talk about more why, but just right off the bat, Fire doesn't actually tell you how to use Fire. And that's a bit problematic. So researchers from the Boston Children's Hospital and the Department of Informatics at Harvard actually created a tool to use Fire and use it effectively. And it was called Smart on Fire. And it actually tells you how you use Fire. How do you use it meaningfully? What tools are there? It standardizes things in a way. It gives you methods to authenticate data. It gives you methods for launching Fire-related apps, and it makes the whole process so much easier. And so this was a tool that I leveraged in my project actually to create an app. And what you'll see here is this is one of the functions that comes with Smart on Fire. It's an Oauth tool, and basically this is how you authorize an app to pull data from an EHR and such. And so with all of that said, after kind of gaining an understanding of EHRs and certain tools like Smart on Fire, I had to then actually code something and create something meaningful. And so I had to figure out how to go about and do that, right? And so I basically had a 4-step approach to going about and doing this. And first, I needed to classify the questions that were in Mamma Screen into their respective Fire resource types. And so, well, if you take, for example, the first question up there, this was a question that's asked on Mamma Screen. It's actually the first question. It's, do you have signs of breast disease now? And it lists some of these things. And, well, what type of a Fire resource would that be stored under? Well, I mean, I'll talk more about this difficulty just in a bit, but I came to the conclusion it could be stored under an observation. It could also be stored under a condition, but we'll get to that later. After classifying different questions into their respective resource types, I had to then gain a developer's license to an EHR sandbox because for whatever reason, these companies are awfully protective of their EHRs. And so this was one of my troubles. And after doing that, I had to then create a server because all this is web-based, right? So Fire, EHRs, the Mamma Screen, these are all web-based things that need to pull information and put them into other places. So you have to create a server to do that. And then after that, I had to struggle a lot and beg developers for code, sometimes shamelessly. but I think it was worth it in the end. And so let's break those steps down just a little bit more. And first, when you have to classify a resource, right? So as a layman, as someone who's not a medical practitioner, there's already like a lot of doubt for me. I don't know how a physician is going to classify something like a tumor found in the breast. I mean, it could be a condition. I mean, it could be an observation. Who knows? It could be an issue. So I already don't know a lot of these things because I'm not a physician. I don't practice. And so I had to basically roughly estimate what I thought would be reasonable. Like, would they do this? I don't know, but this is what I'm putting down. And so after going through that for most of these questions, I generally felt kind of confident about what I did. And then I proceeded to acquire a developer's license. Or at least I tried to, but I mean, I didn't quite. But thankfully, Cerner, and I'm not advertising Cerner in any way, but Cerner was the only platform that I could use an EHR sandbox for free. So if anyone's thinking of developing in the future, Cerner has different Fire sandboxes that work really well. And so I went onto Cerner, I used their sandbox, and it worked really well. And so I had to then go create a server. I was using, or at least I started out using 2 different servers, but I quickly defaulted to one of them because Meteor, the one that Dr. Orwell actually showed me how to use, and thank you so much for that, actually was too complex for me. So I just used a simpler one that did a lot of work for me, which is reply.it, recommended again to anyone developing in Fire. And so here we get to the actual coding part, right? So here's what did I do? How did I go about it? What were the challenges? Well, an observation about this entire process was there's a lot of high-level discussion about how to use Fire, how to use Smart on Fire, how to pull things together. But when it comes to actually doing it, there's not that much stuff out there. And we'll touch on that later, but this was the biggest challenge, I think, to my actual coding. But going through the process, if there were 3 pieces of code that I would recommend or emphasize to any developer who wants to create a Fire app, would be the 3 following. The search method is one that allows you to search any sort of data in your app, and you can pick any sort of data that you need. The fetch all method is very similar, but it allows you to gather the data from an entire resource. And then you have the fire.oauth authorize method, which is how you get tokens and how you go from an EHR to get patient information and stuff. So that might not mean much to you, or it may, I don't know. But if you are going to code, I mean, these are the best methods, I think. And again, I had later on in the project, I got a lot of help from the Cerner Fire developers group, which was very helpful. And so, all right. So I would say going into this project, I was very confident that I would be able to do something good. And that's not because I was confident in my own skills, but it was because I was confident in the fact that there were going to be a lot of resources. So I was 50% right. My skills weren't there, but the resources also weren't there. And so this posed a challenge. As you can see, I thought I'd be able to do something good, create an excellent app, help tremendously with MemoScreen, and such. Wait, actually, hold on. Pause really quickly. I actually need to show you the app. I almost forgot about that. Let me show you the app really quick before I discuss it. So here, this is the reply.it that I was talking about. And so if we are to launch my Fire app from there, just example Fire app, imagine that you're a patient logging in to a Fire app. You click login here. So now you have to log into your EHR. So you type your stuff here, your password, username, whatever. You sign in. And the program asks if you want to connect your app to your EHR. You click allow access. And now this program is a very simple one. It just gets your conditions. But yeah, there are a lot of errors here, but that's more just my program not pulling information that's not there. But here we have, this patient has essential hypertension, different things. And so it just pulls conditions and it shows them. This is a very simple program. But yeah, I mean, that was my program. And again, it's a bit simplistic. It's not quite what I wanted to do, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But I thought I'd be able to create an excellent app. While I think this app is all right, it was not as excellent as I thought it was going to be. So this, in large part, I think was due to the fact that there isn't a lot of resource out there for Fire app developers. It's a really new thing. There isn't much stuff out there, and that makes it challenging to actually code stuff because there's not a lot of help. Again, and the other part was obtaining a developer's license was a bit difficult because these companies are awfully, I think, territorial about their EHRs. And I mean, what did I learn? It was you have to set goals that reflect the maturity of the field you're working in. Given that Fire itself is a very recent thing, and more so for things like Smart on Fire, I think it was a bit wrong for me to be so ambitious. And I think for anybody developing, you have to collaborate because that's the way you get your ideas across and you get new ideas, and it really helps. And yeah, I mean, this was what I thought was going to be a seemingly straightforward project. It wasn't so straightforward, but there were lots of things that I learned, and I hope that you guys are able to take at least some insight away from what I've shared here. And these are the references that we used. Thank you to the National Library of Medicine for allowing us to actually do this internship under their grant and their funding. But also, thank you so much, Dr. Eden, Dr. Orwell, Dr. Nelson, everyone in this room, everyone in the department, for allowing us to do this. I mean, it's been a great time. We've learned so much, so thank you. Seriously, thank you so much. And that's it.
Contribution, and I know you sounded very frustrated, but before Epic, all the mammography information was put into something called MRS.
Oh, really?
And we had to get an extensive effort to back engineer that system because the industry just locks it up. They don't let you do what you want with your own data. So, there's a long track of the record of this sort of thing. And I am not the bioinformatician. Other people in the room are, but it's really frustrating if people want to get clinical data on their own patients and do work with that. So whatever baby steps we take are really useful. So don't be too frustrated.
Thank you.
It's really helpful.
Thank you.
And to bring this tool to the Spanish-speaking women is tremendous. We felt we needed to do that from the first day we worked on mammoth screens. So your work, especially the context of this stuff, patients don't understand risk anyway, whatever language you're in. So to make that more accessible to this huge, important population is just a great contribution. So I'm really glad you came and did this work. Thank you so much.
I'd like to echo what Dr. Nelson said. Even though you may feel like these are small steps, these actually are very important steps for our project. And your information will be information we can use in the future. So I just appreciate that. I appreciate the lessons learned. And I'm sure there's a few in this audience who might echo some of your lessons learned with their projects. But also, I just want to reemphasize that we appreciate the work and the contribution that you've made this summer. And I don't know whether Ben has any. Oh, we've got another question here. Whether Ben has questions about the. Yeah. Okay.
Great job for a great presentation and project. So my question is for Gokul, and I was curious to know, so if you were going to continue working on this project in the future, you had mentioned that there was a group at Boston Children's and Harvard who are working on actual instructions and educational materials for working on fire related projects, and what would you see as a new beginner? What resources would you be interested in developing, documentation wise or tutorials, that you think would be most useful to the community for other groups or researchers in other informatics programs to actually speed along the process that it looks like was very challenging for you?
I think centrally the issue is not so much a lack of resources in very specific arenas, but a lack of resources in general. And so it's difficult for me to say specifically what would be required when it's just an utter lack altogether. And I mean, it's understandable because of how recent this is, right? It makes sense. But I think as this field develops and as more and more people start coding in it, and granted, it'll be difficult to get into it and to actually do things, but that process might slow. It might start slowly, but it'll get quicker. And you know, it's like as those resources are spread and you know, and as they proliferate, I think that everybody will have an easier time coding. I mean, as for like specifics, I would say like
something like you wrote up, you know, these were the three things that I found most useful.
Okay.
Something like that
Yeah.
would be, you know, if you were a new beginner and another researcher who wanted to develop or translate it or actually implement decision aid or other Fire app, like this is where you should begin kind of thing. And if you were to do this type of project with some sort of tutorial that sort of highlighted those like key findings, be something that you think would be useful to the community.
Oh, absolutely, right. I mean, the hardest part is always starting.
Documentation.
Yeah, correct. And so I think if there were more resources out there for like how to just get something small, right? Like, I mean, those methods were fairly simple methods, but like the Oauth function that I mentioned, like you can't have a Fire program without having that method, and it's like you need that. And so I totally agree with you. Maybe I know what I find helpful personally, not just in this regard, but in any sort of academic endeavors, like having a YouTube video to tell me like what I'm doing, because I don't know. And so if there were YouTube videos about this, man, I would be very happy. But unfortunately, there aren't so many. But you know, it's to be expected. But like that would be wonderful. Just like a YouTube playlist, like how to create an app, and then it shows you how to do it. Yeah. I hope I've answered your question. Yeah.
I'm Ben Orwell, and I totally feel your pain. I think, you know, we worked on this early in the summer, and I think you have learned a lot about this process, and you know, have run up against a lot of the same challenges that I've also experienced, and I'm sure that others have. And you know, I hope that maybe this is something that you'll think about continuing to play around with in your future. And I know you haven't quite figured out exactly like where you're going, but I do think it's early times, and the documentation is very scattered and sparse, and that I hope that efforts like these, and if we continue to have success in the Mamoscreen project, integrating this as a Fire application, that it'll sort of be a watershed and sort of a dam that opens up, and a flood of kind of applications and new ways of using these kinds of patient data resources will be available to people. And I think one thing that I hope over the next few years here is that we can really try to create an environment that fosters participation amongst the students and the faculty and just the OHSU community in this process, because as you said, it's really frustrating when companies, EHRs, and other groups try to tightly control and lock down all of the access to use data, and I think that it's starting to open up, and the best way to get it to continue to open up is to use it and try to push the limits and sort of say, we're hitting against this wall and we need you to open it up more, and I hope that that's going to continue to happen. So I'm glad that you had an interesting time, and I'm really looking forward to what we can do with this in the future.
Thank you.
So nice work, you two. It's a really good presentation. So question for Gokul. So say you use Cerner with this project, but say someone at OHSU wanted this, right? And we use Epic here. What challenges would you foresee in having to translate all of the stuff that you did into Epic?
So presumably the only difference would be getting access to an Epic sandbox. I think it's called like App Garden or something like that. Is that, Doctor, was that correct for Epic? App Orchard, that's what it is, yeah. So like, in theory, nothing would be the difference, because like Fire and Smart on Fire are supposed to, like, their motto is plug in and play. You should be able to switch EHR seamlessly. So like, what I'm thinking now is there should be no issue. Until you do it, you won't notice the issue. So like honestly, like I'm saying this now, but like don't hold me to it. So like there might be a lot of issues, but in theory there shouldn't be an issue.
Yeah, so I think that's a good point. Like in theory, there, you know, if you
Yeah.
tried to look into the future, there might not be. But then I think it's also interesting that like Cerner and Epic do play differently. Like for example, if you're looking for certain keywords or terms,
Yeah.
or you know variables within Cerner that they might not exist in Epic. So like
Right.
that might be
Yeah.
one thing that you might have a challenge with. You might have to change your code. And
Yeah.
like in theory, Smart on Fire is supposed to be, you know, the most interoperable thing.
Yeah.
Like you just use it once and done. But I think, as you've said before, like there's not many resources, so people probably have to still figure out what
Yeah.
needs to be done in each environment. But yeah, you
Yeah.
guys did a really nice job this summer.
Thank you.
Very useful in the future as we go on, and I think it should be usable in any of the regions that you choose to implement Memscreen. Yeah.
But I just wondered if you made any observations of the differences between the 65-year-old and the 30-year-old.
I mean, one of the biggest differences was the time they had. Those that were younger usually tended to have kids, and so the worries that they had, what they cared about, they cared more about the decision aid and the options you gave on what was important to them, and the older people cared a little bit more about the risk assessment and their family history and how that would possibly affect their own children.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you both.
Hi. So I have a question actually for Ayo. Amazing work, both of you. And, you know, medical translation is a very tricky field, right? And the literature is replete with articles on how poorly people do. I love what you've done, and I'm really interested in hearing the process that you went through. I wanted to ask you if you're planning to share this in a publication somewhere so that it could be perhaps used to develop that tool in other languages. Some of these things that you've described sound like they, you know, they would work in other ethnic groups or, you know, in other languages as well. Do you have plans on sort of working in that field a little bit more or publishing?
As of currently, no, I hadn't thought of that. But as I've been working with this project, I've definitely tried looking up articles on this subject, and yeah, they vary in the topics they talk about, and yeah, there's no set format. I tried looking for formats and like guides to follow, and there really wasn't much. I know that I definitely would have appreciated having some sort of structure to go off of. So, if possible, I think I would like to leave some sort of trampoline that others can jump off of and like get a head start. So in the future, yes, that might be something I'd pursue.
Literal translation versus figurative translation was quite challenging because words like injury and harm mean very different things, and so we have to have a lot on the plain language piece of it in an earlier age that we did, and so we would have to go through a similar process, but I think we have a very good start as a foundation.
I had a question for Ayo. I was wondering if you could speak to, you had mentioned that, there's lots of dialects of Spanish, and sort of what your approach was for the translations you worked on. Did you use like your intuition and the dialects that you were most familiar with? Did you try to find meanings of words that were consistent across all the dialects you're familiar with? Just speaking a little bit about that, like cross-checking of, the basically using words that have the most number of people probably have the same intuition about what they mean.
Yeah. So the first time that I started translating, it was really just on what I was familiar with and what I knew. However, as I interviewed people and talked to more people, I definitely took their thoughts into account, and I tried to find different people from different backgrounds so that I could get as big of a sample as I could with a diverse sample that had different opinions on the words. And I try to keep it as the language as basic as I could. Sometimes, for example, screen, there's an actual word for it in Spanish. However, most people wouldn't know like what it was. Yeah. And so descriptions had to be used, and there's still definitely like some no. I just spaced out on what I was going to say. No. In a dictionary, there's... No.
Okay, what was the sentence?
A dictionary has a word, and then it has the...
It has the meaning?
Yeah, so...
Meaning?
Yeah, so there's definitely like some words that should have an extra meaning attached to it, like an extra description of the meaning. I know that that's something that in the English version, mammogram, we have that, and I unfortunately wasn't able to work on on translating that, but that's definitely something that I think would further help fix that ambiguity going forward.
All right, thank you. Well, hold on. How's that clapping?
Thanks. So good morning. My name is Joan Ash, and I have the pleasure of introducing Keaton Whitaker, who was working with me and the team that is doing a study of scribing. He's been working with us over the summer. I should tell you a little bit about him. He is going into his junior year at Berkeley, UC Berkeley. He has a double major in public health and oratory. And when I asked him about that during the interview, he said, well, oratory is all about persuasion, and we need more of that in public health, so it makes perfect sense. He actually came to us with some research experience, both at Stanford and at Berkeley in the public health arena, and so he has a solid background in quantitative methods. But again, I was recruiting someone for qualitative work, which is what our team needed. And he said, well, I have done a little qualitative work and I really want to learn more about it, and I'm very interested in mixed methods. And I thought, this is the perfect candidate, right? So he's been working with us over the summer to develop a Delphi study, and he'll tell you more about it and how that fits into the overall work that we've been doing.
Can you hear me through this? Awesome. Thank you so much, Joan, for the introduction. Thank you for the opportunity to work with you this summer. I really enjoyed the work I got to do, and I'm excited to present it here. So my presentation today focuses on the Delphi method and how it applies to scribing. I'll start off by exploring the field of scribing a little bit and the background to it, going into the different methods that are needed to approach a field like scribing and a field like informatics in general, and then talking specifically about the Delphi method and the Delphi technique and the intricacies of that, and then how we applied the Delphi method to study scribing for Dr. Ash's project. I don't know why the slides aren't quite configured, but we'll see if that gets better. Before we can talk about scribes, we actually have to go back and talk about the electronic health record, or the EHR. Since doctors have been slowly switching over to the electronic health record from paper records, there's a lot of great things that have come along with the EHR, including better care and the ability to care for patients better, but there's also been a lot of unintended consequences that have been studied by Dr. Ash and her colleagues. These include if a clinician is using the EHR, then they spend a lot more time inputting patient data into the computer. They have less time or less eye contact with patients, and then there's an overall burden on the provider that really has promoted physician burnout, and that's been a big problem. There's been a few ways to kind of circumvent these issues that have arisen with the EHR, to really untether the provider from having to be the inputter of all this information. And one proposed solution to this problem is to use medical scribes. A medical scribe being an unlicensed individual that's hired by the clinician to input patient data under their supervision and allow them to not be so burdened by the EHR. Since the EHR is new, this idea of using medical scribes to take notes and enter data is also pretty new. In 2014, there were less than 20,000 scribes in the United States, and then by 2020, there's projected to be over 100,000. So this field, medical scribing is the fastest growing profession in medicine right now. By 2020, there's expected to be one scribe for every 9 physicians out there. And then along with this, there's also 22 scribing companies that train scribes and develop scribes that can go work for doctors and be a scribe in the medical field. But since it's so new, these scribes are not well studied, well understood, and as a result, they are unregulated in a lot of places. But then even more important than that is that how do we know that scribes are the Band-Aid that's going to fix this problem with the EHR? How do we know that medical scribes are the solution and that they're not going to falter with the technical difficulties and the frustrations of using the EHR that clinicians have run into, that nurses have run into, that MAs have run into? What makes scribes so special about being trained and using this EHR that has kind of given some other people so much grief? To approach a field like scribing or like informatics, though, you can't just rely on one form of study. I'm from a very quantitative background. That's where a lot of my research has been done before. And that's what I'm familiar with, working with data as number sets. It's deductive. You can test theories. It's objective, generalizable, and comfortable, consistent. But taking a step back from that, if you don't have the chance to actually use quantitative data, if there's no opportunity to generate quantitative data, you really have to start from qualitative data, which is what you use as an inductive research type to build theories that you can eventually test later. Qualitative data is very different than quantitative, just in its nature. It's subjective and contextual. And I come from a place where quantitative data is very privileged over qualitative data, and that's considered the gold standard. But coming into a field where I know is going to be working with qualitative data, it's important to not read these lists as the strengths of quantitative data alone, but these are 2 different lists of strengths of different research methods. So you're going to use different parts of these lists to get at your research project. And they're just different ways of seeking the truth as you're conducting research. But since I'm unfamiliar with qualitative research, I had a few hurdles to overcome when working with data as interviews and words instead of number sets. And the big one is finding confidence, real confidence in qualitative data, because it's not as consistent, it's contextual and subjective. So I had the opportunity to work on a few other projects on the side for Dr. Ash, and I got to code some interviews and other pieces of qualitative data, and these are the big takeaways for me that help me get real confident with qualitative data. The first is that all qualitative research is hermeneutic in its approach. That means all the knowledge you construct for your research is based on the text and the conversation that the researcher is having with the text. It's a very grounded theory, so you're always going to refer back to the actual data that you collected in order to make your theories and find your patterns. Next is that there is coding involved with qualitative data, although it's very separate from quantitative coding or computer coding. I think the best way to think about it is it's sorting patterns that you see in the interviews and looking at theories that come up and reoccurrences in all of your interviews and across sites, and developing those patterns into theories for your findings. So when you're coding and when you're looking for these patterns, that is a big analysis part. It takes being active and really paying attention to what you're reading to make those analyses. And then the other part is that when you code in teams or dyads if they're teams of 2, or sometimes you code in bigger teams, so you always have someone else to cross-reference your work, check what you're doing, and see that patterns are consistently being built out of these data sets. But with informatics, it doesn't just take quantitative or qualitative, it is a mix of both. And when you do mixed methods research, it's not a willy-nilly mix of just quantitative and qualitative. There's a very there's a pragmatic approach to it where you're really trying to select the strengths from both of those different types of research to create the method that's going to get at the heart of your research the best. So when you are conducting this type of research, there's a huge focus on the link between your procedure and why you're actually conducting that procedure, what you're hoping to get out of that, out of those forms of research. And then lastly, mixed methods research, it's fairly new, and it's becoming more and more accepted and more established. Journals are more frequently accepting qualitative papers and mixed methods papers, but they always require a justification of why they chose to do certain methods, be they quantitative or qualitative, and what those methods did to serve their research purpose. So I've been reading up on a lot of mixed methods and doing a lot of work with them, and they come up a lot for me this summer. So in all of our Thursday meetings where we had people come present to us, I found examples of mixed methods research that really stuck out to me. And they're just different organizations of these quantitative and qualitative structures, mixing and matching these different methods. And when you mix and match, you do get to these specific strengths of these studies where having a qualitative first and then a quantitative can give you a certain edge on what you're trying to research. So if you have a preliminary qualitative study that leads into a big quantitative study, that's a really good way to generate hypotheses potentially for future testing. Dr. Peter Graven that came to talk to us last week, at the end he talked a lot about establishing causality through epidemiologic methods. And a really key way to do that is to first do a qualitative study to suss out potential confounding factors in epidemiologic tools before you move on to your heavy quantitative study. If you flip that, instead you have a quantitative analysis that leads into a core qualitative study. That's a really good way to look at subgroups and then get into the big piece that you want to study. Dr. Michael Chang came to talk to us, and he, in his talk, he mentioned the paper from Dr. Vimala Patel, and she looked at doctor notes before and after the implementation of the EHR, and that was her qualitative piece. But before she did that, she really looked at numbers of diagnoses from different note structures and how often certain types of information were included in EHR notes versus handwritten notes. If you have follow-up studies instead, a core study followed by a core quantitative study followed by a follow-up qualitative study, for example, that is a really good way to explore significance of outsiders or just any anomalies you might find in your data set. And a great example I found of that was the work of Dr. Eden, Dr. Nelson, whose interns just presented. But they, with their app that they're developing, they ran their quantitative test, and then with follow-up interviews, the women that used the app, they found out that they had already planned on being screened prior to that study, and that was a really key piece of information that they use to better their work. And then flipping that one more time, core qualitative going into a quantitative study, that's a great example of the Delphi method where you're trying to develop measures of key concepts and then hopefully testing them later. And the Delphi method is what I get to go into now. The Delphi method is what I got to work with this summer. It takes its name from the Oracle of Delphi. If anyone read Percy Jackson growing up, you might be familiar with, oh good, we did. You might be familiar with the Oracle of Delphi. It's from Greek mythology. In ancient Greece, the Oracle was the high priestess of the Temple of Apollo, and they were thought to be able to predict the future. So people would come to them to get predictions about what would happen. Historians think that maybe the Delphi used natural signs to predict the future and just make broad statements. But that's where our study gets the name, because the Delphi method, its purpose is to make predictions and forecasts about the future of certain fields. The Delphi method gets its power from a panel of experts in the field that make these predictions with the help of the research formats. And the big things that come out of the Delphi study are identification of important issues in a field, and then secondly, it yields a lot of qualitative data that can be worked with to make further inquiry into a field or into a place of study. And this is key because Delphi studies are typically used when not a lot of information is known about a field, and it's the first step into making broader explorations into an area that hasn't really been studied before. This is the general pattern of how a Delphi method runs, although there's variations that you make according to each specific study that you do. So it all starts with brainstorming and defining a general problem in a field, which is done by usually the investigators and the panelists, the expert panelists together after the expert panelists have been assembled. And then you go into your rounds of surveys. What's unique about the Delphi is that all of the experts never actually have to meet. All of the rounds of inquiry are done through surveys that are sent from the researcher to the expert panels, which is nice because it's a little bit cheaper that way. But after you brainstorm the problem, you go to round one, in which you take all the big list of issues and you narrow them down. So each expert panelist will have a chance to confirm the list of issues, add to the list of issues, change it, or suggest modifications to it in general. After you have your set list of issues down, you move on to round two, which is ranking the importance of these issues to the field in the near future. After you rank them, then it's up to the researchers to establish concordance among those rankings. If they find concordance, then awesome, they did it, and they can publish their findings. But if they didn't, then they go back and revise their survey rounds, revise their ranking round to either better explain their issues to hopefully establish concordance. So this all looks great, but it's not very straightforward. It can get a little bit messy sometimes, and it really helped. I started to wonder, what's the purpose of doing all this? Like, why don't just have a random person come in and predict the future? Is that any different from what we're doing here? And it reminded me of this great quote: "The Oracle of Delphi didn't know crap. Anybody can get high and predict the future." And it really stuck with me, actually, because I did want to make a hard distinction and draw a hard line between just random predictions and what the actual use of going through all of the roundabout of the Delphi is. So there's a few big key strengths to the Delphi, and the first is the expert panelists. These expert panelists are not just the PhDs, although you can't have PhDs on your panel. It's a diverse range of people that all know a lot about the issue. They can be on the ground, working in the field, studying different aspects of the field, and your goal is to get a very big and broad look at the issue from your expert panelists. The second is that your experts are anonymous to each other, and this is really key because then there's no opportunity for groupthink to take over. There's no mob mentality. The loudest voice in the room doesn't win. The prettiest voice doesn't win. The richest voice doesn't win. It's everyone's voice gets the same consideration, the same opportunity to make an impact on this study. The big thing about the Delphi, I guess I should a little bit reframe it. It's not about predicting the future. It's about identifying key issues for the future. And that's something useful that you can take away out of the study because these issues are both the input and the output of a Delphi. And then lastly, it does help you build theory about what's really going on in a field, which is a big aspect of why Delphis are actually becoming more popular. There's been a lot more published in recent years. I'm forever the skeptic, so I kind of wanted to go back and look at Delphi studies that had worked or had made an impact. So In 2004, there was a study done on nurse informaticians about what skills nurses really need to know in relation to informatics. And this has been a big study in this field, informatics particularly. There's a lot of Delphi studies going on in informatics and in health sciences right now just because it's a fast-growing field, and it's important to know and be able to predict upcoming or arising issues or where the field's going. The second one is, it was a Delphi, it was a 2004 study out of Hawaii in the communications field, and what they did is they looked at a Delphi that was published 16 years prior, and then they measured the predictions made by that Delphi with what was actually happening in the field today, and they found most of the predictions that were made 16 years ago to be highly accurate. And then lastly, the Delphi on academic health sciences done in the 1980s is very relevant to what we do actually here, because that Delphi was used to secure some funding to start an information sciences program here at OHSU. And the funding from that grant actually helped to build the building we're in today and to start the DMICE program. So we all have a Delphi to thank for this internship this summer, or partially to thank. Going back to the work I got to do this summer was applying this Delphi method to scribing. So there's a few modifications that we made because that's what you do in mixed methods research, because you really want to fit the process to what you're trying to study and what you're trying to get at. So first off, you have, we changed it from issues involved with scribing to CAS involved with scribing. CAS standing for knowledge, attitudes, and skills of scribes. Because we're not concerned with the scribing industry. We don't necessarily need to know where that's going. We need to know how scribes are going to better serve clinicians through being competent. The ultimate goal with this is to take these competencies that we built, the input and output of the Delphi study, and develop them into training modules so that we can be sure that these scribes that are going into the field are there and able to serve the physicians so that the physicians can better do their work. And then secondly, there's actually two separate Delphi survey lists that are currently being sent out. One related to general work for scribes, which is just being a member of a medical team and being able to work well in that environment. And then another survey that is specifically related to the EHR and the ability and skill set to navigate the EHR, input it, and be the master of the EHR so that the clinician really doesn't have to worry about that. And for our study, the selection of experts was really, really wide. Dr. Ash was in charge of making that list, narrowing that down, and finally collecting these experts, but they do come from all different fields. And they're experts, not necessarily in scribing, although some of them are, but they're experts in the scribe-provider-EHR interaction, because that's what we're interested in. That's where these consequences have arisen, and that's what we really need to get at if we're going to, if this Delphi is really going to serve our intended purpose. So back to this model, Dr. Ash held all the brainstorming for this big list of CAS initially, and then the work I did this summer was going from that step to round one. So taking all of this big lists of CAS, 89 in total, and then translating them into a survey for all of the experts to see and have a chance to modify, add, subtract, anything they want before that list of CAS is finalized. After that, now we're hopefully, that survey has now been sent out, and we're in the process of collecting that data from the experts. After we collect that back, we'll send out the second round of survey so that these experts can rank the importance of these CAS. And then once they return that, it's up to the researchers to establish concordance among those rankings. And if not, then we'll have to go back and remodify our survey. But if we do, then we can make some judgments off of our findings. In this round one, this is an example of a CAS included in the general survey for the cognition of scribes. Any scribe needs to have mental stamina. That's the basic CAS, and then with every CAS we also included a meaning so that every expert that reads this is sure of what that CAS is intended to mean. And with this, they are given 3 multiple choice options. They can keep this CAS, or they can not keep or change this CAS. And if they choose to not keep or change, then we ask them their reasoning so that we can track why they chose to do certain things and incorporate that into our study as well. And additionally, they're allowed to add any CAS so that we can have a full and complete record of the CAS that these experts think are important to the field. After that, in round 2, the ranking aspect, once it's all ranked, the big tool that's used to assess this ranking, I'm sorry about these slides, but is Kendall's W coefficient for concordance. So it looks like a big scary equation, but what it really comes down to is that you put all the expert rankings into that equation. If W equals 0, then that means no expert agreed with any other experts. They were all incredibly different. It's a nightmare, and you also probably did something wrong because that's not likely to happen. Experts should have some degree of concordance with them. Likewise, if W equals 1, then every researcher agreed on every single ranking. You've performed an absolute miracle, and you also probably did something wrong because that's not going to happen either. More than likely, your W is going to fall in the middle range, and the number you're looking for is 0.7. Generally, it's accepted that if your W is above 0.7, then you can say that you've established concordance, and you can move on to handling your results. These are two examples from the EHR component. Any scribe needs to be familiar with templates, and any scribe needs to be able to track provider corrections in the EHR. It's a little bit hard to give theoretical predictions about how these will be ranked, but hopefully with the ranking you'd be able to say something along the lines of X percentage of experts agreed that one CAS was X percentage more important than the other. Although there's a plethora of different ways that you can quantitatively present your rankings. Going back to the purpose for all this study, the big end goal is to develop competencies for scribes for this Delphi study, which will serve the greater purpose of developing training modules for these scribes that hopefully they can use to be better prepared to go into the field. So currently we're on the second block on our way to making these training modules, but it's an important step because we need to make sure that the scribes that are going into the field are accurately trained and appropriately trained so that they can untether the provider from the EHR and the provider can continue to give the good quality that they know how to give. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope we have time for a few questions if they're out there.
Thank you for that great presentation explaining the Delphi method. I got to participate in the Delphi method about 10 years ago when we were an international body forming standards for how to develop decision aids and what the content should be. And I will tell you, it was very messy at the beginning. We started with this big, huge, long list of standards and did a lot of refinement, a lot of dialogue. But what came out of it are a checklist of standards. So it was important work. It doesn't happen instantly, though. We probably took a year or two of different rounds and iterations and repeating things. So I think you're learning quite a bit. And most of us are also quantitative people with some qualitative training. So we were all having to, learn too what this Delphi process is.
Thanks for this. When you were showing that diagram, you talked a little bit about what happens when folks don't come to consensus. And I wondered, especially when you have a single person like Dr. Ash, selecting the experts, the area of scribing is certainly an area where I think there's people who think scribes are a way to go with this problem, but a lot of people also think kind of how much can you go with automating this? So instead of inserting another human, how do you go in terms of automating this process? And so I'd be curious about whether this is with your project or with your background reading, where you saw thoughts about including experts who actually have fairly divergent opinions at the beginning, and how do you actually deal in your Delphi with where people don't come to consensus, recognizing that that is an actual reportable important finding that different groups think differently about this particular part of this work?
Question. And one of the big strengths of the Delphi is that there is definitely room to report outliers like that if you do have these big differences in the best way to solve this EHR problem. And one of the big things, going back to just the very beginning of deciding whether or not to go with scribes or something else, is that scribes are sometimes, by a lot of people actually, looked at as more of a short-term solution. Short-term being until the EHR is at the point where providers themselves can just input that information directly and skip the scribe, the medical scribe, hopefully entirely. So when you're talking about the competencies that scribes are supposed to develop for these modules, yes, this is looking at the immediate future because we know that the EHR is not really going to get to a point where it can just be the provider for a while. I mean, I'm not sure about the exact forecast for that, but I know it's out there. And I know that people are also looking out for that to happen. So in that, it's looking at once the EHR is at that level where providers don't necessarily need an assistant to input that, what then does the role of the scribe become? Are they obsolete, or is there still room for them to assist with documentation or the betterment of the healthcare process in some regard?
And if I can put this in a little more context, I was not the only one selecting the expert panel. Everyone on our research team helped, and in particular Jeff Gold and Vishnu, but also Dean Siddig, for example. I asked some people who know a lot of people. We started with a list. We wanted some professional associations represented, so we asked someone from the AMA, and we got a vice president to come, Christine Sinsky, who has written quite a bit about scribing. We wanted someone from the AAMC, et cetera, et cetera. Then we wanted providers. We wanted representatives of scribes. We wanted industry, and that was so interesting because we did get a representative from Scribe America and a representative from Scribe X. So we did invite about 30 people from all different roles to be part of the expert panel. And to go back even further, the original list of competencies was based on the field work we had done at 5 sites around the country where we were gathering best practices. And we did our analysis of all of the interviews and field notes looking for competencies there. We did a literature search about competencies. And then we had a conference. And at the conference, and it was the same experts, so they know who they are, but they don't know what input they're giving during these distance survey pieces. So at the conference, and Keaton knows a lot about this because he got to analyze the conference proceedings, which are crazy when you've got 30 experts talking. For each of the competencies, when he put it into the survey, he read the transcripts to see what they said so that the wording would be as they wanted it and not as I wanted it or as Keaton wanted it. So I hope that helps.
Yeah. Thanks for clarifying. Yeah.
So, I mean, this entire thing could be going way over my head, so just stop me if I'm asking a terrible question. But I'm curious, how does, like, the time scale of your study affect how likely, like, your experts are to conform? Like, well, I know it's, like, anonymous, but, like, how many rounds do you have to go through? Like, does that make sense? Like,
yeah.
If you have a shorter time scale, will people, like, conform more because they don't want to do it again?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a really good question, and attrition of experts is a really big deal in any study. But with the Delphi study, you're really lucky to have these experts that have given their time to the study. So you do want to treat them actually really well when you're sending out these surveys. So the first thing is that the surveys are meticulously designed so that it's the least amount of effort on the people that are filling them out. So that means that you really have to be streamlined with it so it doesn't take too much of their time, because otherwise they're less likely to finish it and you're less likely to get the data. But after that, so it's the first round and the second round are the mandatory ones. And you do ask them for their reasoning behind their choices so that you can collect some of that data too. But you're absolutely right. You don't want to overburden your experts here with unnecessary steps. And you won't keep repeating this round after round after round. After a certain point, you've collected the data you can, and people are set in their ways, and you're not just aiming for concordance the whole time. That's the happy result that happens. If you don't establish concordance, then you still accumulated hopefully a lot of qualitative data to look through anyway, but you shouldn't be exhausting your experts to the point where they're out.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I so
Thank you.